So welcome to this conversation with, and in this case, we have the honor of having here Renée Friedman. She's editor-in-chief at Exante with a lifelong interest in economics, geopolitics, and sustainability issues. Intellectually curious economist and editor adept in integrating ESG, sustainability, financials, economics, and political perspectives into policy briefs, risk strategies, research programs and products for business, financial, governments, and institutional clients. Expertise in emerging markets, political risks, macroeconomic and sovereign research and analysis, debt and fixed income research, investment strategy, including ESG green, and domestic and international framework and policy development. Experienced in stakeholder engagement, budget management, quality and quantitative analysis, and project management. Well, actually, Renée, kind of reading the bio, it's outstanding. So we have, it's an honor actually to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Having this interview. And well, I just wanted to tell you that that is just an honor. So the stage is yours. I'm gonna listen carefully. So later I will throw you some questions and then we will be finishing. Okay.
Excellent. Yes, this is quite an extensive list of things of mine. Right. Today, I really wanted to speak to you about inflation, the energy crunch we've been experiencing, particularly over the past couple of years, and the future outlook. So to start off with, let's take a look at what really was behind. We'll go through what was behind the energy crunch, price crunch, how it is contributing to inflation, how it has contributed, particularly over the past year, and will for the next 1 to 2 years, where inflation will be above central bank target rates. The impact this is having on consumer demand and economic growth, both globally and within Europe, and obviously within specific European countries. The central bank reaction, we've had different reactions globally, and why the ECB's reaction differs from the US Federal Reserve's reaction. Reasons why energy prices and inflation might stay higher for longer than has been previously anticipated. And I'll touch upon the specific situation for Spain. So when we look at this, we think about what was behind the energy price surge. So I'm just going to update my notes here. And as we can see, gas, oil, and coal have all gone up tremendously, 290%, 50%, and 47% respectively on a year-on-year basis. So it's essentially led to a tripling of prices across Europe. So Europe has had a greater energy shock than the US. One of the main reasons, of course, is that US is a net producer of energy and Europe is not. Europe imports about 1/3 of its energy, particularly its gas. And this has had ripple effects on other commodities. So it's pushed up the price of other commodities. So as gas has gone up, oil's gone up as well, coal has gone up, as well as we've moved from one to the other in terms of energy sources. And it's also pushed up the price of food and drink, because obviously it's affected, the increase in energy price has affected, for example, fertilizer production, which is affected the price of food. So we see this knock-on effect. So why did energy prices surge? Well, obviously post-COVID, we've seen a level of increasing demand as economies reopened. In 2020, demand had dropped quite a bit. The prices had dropped quite a bit. So it's a rebound, and even more than a rebound, it's a very sudden surge. The other big issue is that winter 2020 was quite harsh. And so coming into 2021, there were a very low level of European energy stocks. There was also the situation of weather events, in that we had poor wind generation. Some countries such as the Netherlands and UK particularly depended upon wind generations. They had to then transfer to another source of energy, which was gas, hence increasing the price of gas. The other point on this has been climate change policies, as Europe has pledged to move towards net zero. And this has been, when I talk about climate change policies, I'll go into this a bit more later. We've seen this in the increase in the price of greenhouse gas emission allowances and greenflation, which I'll explain in a little bit. The other point, of course, is our geopolitical events. There have been issues around perhaps Russia, which, as I said, supplies about a third of energy, gas in particular, to Europe, potentially held back its supplies as it needed to refill its own supplies. And there was also a bit of a question on whether or not it was putting pressure, particularly on Germany, for Nord Stream 2. The other big thing, of course, and this goes back towards climate change policies, has been that we have seen the phasing out of coal plants in recent years. So this is, limited the opportunity to switch fuels when price rises. And the other big thing, when I go back to that weather, is that even trying to get more energy supplies out of the US was quite difficult in 2021 because US storms curbed Texas, which is the major oil producing and gas producing part of the US. It reduced their gas exports. So those are the main reasons that we see happening in terms of the surge in energy prices. And again, you see this reflected in here. It's a chart from Refinitiv of the changing price of Brent crude, which is the benchmark. So it's gone up quite dramatically over the past 2 years, as you can see. And one of the big things that we know, of course, is that world oil markets are widely expected to remain prone to geopolitics in 2022. And we'll go into that a bit further later on. About what has been happening recently and what will likely happen over the next few months at least, and how that will also continue the higher energy prices. So how is this contributing to inflation and growth? The main thing, of course, is that increasing energy prices translates into increasing input prices for goods and services. Basically, it becomes a lot more expensive for companies to produce things. And we've also seen this, of course, hitting household budgets and levels of consumer confidence. Consumers are less confident. They're feeling that pinch in their pocketbooks. They're feeling that pinch in their wallets. They're less likely to spend, which is going to threaten the economic recovery. And the fact is, we'll see the numbers in the forecasts for 2022 and 2023 is that and one of the reasons why the ECB isn't acting quite quickly yet is because Europe has not recovered as quickly as the US has. So the big thing with this, as I said, it reduces discretionary outlays, so what people are spending, and again, as I said, slows the economic recovery. The other way that it is increasing and contributing to inflation is through increasing wage prices. So as we have increasing input prices into goods, it is reflected in hitting consumers. And consumers, when they are looking, consumers are workers, and when workers are looking for jobs, we're seeing some wage price increase. The other side of this, of course, is that for companies, the increase in input cost, it lowers margins for them. This is unless, of course, productivity is also increasing, and we've not seen a massive increase in productivity. So therefore, company reports may not be as good moving forward. That may explain some of the reasons. So where else did inflation come from? Inflation came from the shift towards goods consumption. So people are looking to buy things. They're at home, they're buying things online in particular, right? They're no longer out demanding services. Services were closed. COVID happened. People were not working, particularly in Spain, obviously it's a huge issue. People weren't going out to restaurants. They weren't going to tourist areas. So the general service sector has been greatly affected. So people were shifting more towards goods consumption. And that affected global supply chain networks during the pandemic. There were delays. All that sudden demand We saw delays in shipping. And part of those delays in shipping were because people at the ports couldn't work because they were ill or they were shut down because of COVID. Also saw a massive rise in shipping costs coming through. It also affected road transport. Again, people couldn't travel. There are COVID restrictions imposed by various countries within Europe. And of course, staffing problems. As I said, people weren't able to actually go into work. And what that really did as well is it highlighted the very fragile nature of the just-in-time logistics lean inventory ideas that have come into play since, say, the 1970s, 1980s, really. And it got companies and quite frankly, countries quite nervous because it made them realize that they were very reliant on one country for their sourcing. And we've now seen a renewed focus on onshoring. So bringing some of those jobs back to some countries, issues around for some countries in terms of as they think about moving forward post-pandemic into their own industrial policies. So the resulting disruption in global trade has led to shortages and higher prices. Basically, it's a case of demand outstripping supply. And in fact, we see this impact on growth. Growth has been up. Obviously, we have had a bit of a recovery on this. The IMF came out on Tuesday with their latest forecast for growth. They expect overall Eurozone growth to be 3.9% in 2022. And growth to Spain. Spain was the worst affected of all the economies, I should say, within Europe. It had a drop of over 10%. I think it was 10.3% in 2020 in terms of growth. Again, what are the big employment areas within Spain? It's tourism in particular. It's restaurants, it's tourism, it's everything around that as well. All the auxiliary industries around that support it. So Spain really suffered the most within Europe, within this. And as hopefully COVID situation, I know there's a bit of a wave occurring again now, but as that situation is expected to improve, as more people become vaccinated, and Omicron variant, which is the prevailing variant at present, does not seem to be as devastating as the original variant was. So growth is forecast, I said, for 4.9% in Spain, looking at 5.8% in 2020. That was 4.9% at the end of 2021, sorry, 5.8% in 2022, and then dropping again in 3.8% in 2023. So it's going to be a big surge, hopefully, this year, once we get over that Omicron bump, as it were, and probably see growth really pick up towards the latter part of the year. And in fact, this is reflected in the work of the Bank of Spain, which raised its inflation outlook on 17th December to 3.7%. For 2022, and then reducing it down the following year. This is aligned with the overall ECB view. It is forecasting that the soaring electricity costs, which have more than tripled, I believe, in Spain and across Europe, and the supply disruptions will fade out towards the end of this year or into early next year. So one of the big things is really the different reactions to this inflation issue, right? We've seen this quite a bit within the markets. There's been a lot of volatility in the markets around this. And this is, the equity markets have performed very, very well during this time, 2020, 2021 in particular, performing very, very well. We've seen treasuries, both the US treasuries in terms of the yield curve going up. We've also seen most recently as well within Europe, because there are certain reaction about, well, whether or not the ECB will react because inflation is remaining so high. In the US, they have decided that inflation is a lot stickier than what they'd anticipated. It's not transitory as they initially said. So what they have done is move to increase their taper purchases, ending their purchases, bond purchases, by early March. And they're maintaining their benchmark policy rate for now, but they are looking to potentially increase their benchmark policy rate in March if the conditions are ripe for that. They have not yet discussed how they will remove what they already hold, the assets they already hold. Most likely they have suggested, there was a slight suggestion in yesterday's discussion that the Fed chairperson, Jerome Powell, gave after the Fed meeting, that they will look to just let them time out, essentially. So let them run to the end of their bond period. However, it's a different situation for the ECB. And the ECB at this point in time is still saying that inflation is still transitory, although they are now slowly admitting that it will be around for longer and that it will not get below target until 2023. They've agreed to continue their net asset purchases under the PEP program at the end of March 2022, but questions remain how they will again roll off that PEP portfolio. So what this comes down to, and I'll explain why in a moment, why there are differences between the different policies that have been taken and the effect that that will have potentially on markets. The chief concern in general, most people think the markets have, is that any hesitation about inflation will actually force central banks to tighten credit very quickly later on, which would cause a lot of pain. It would cause a lot of disruption to the market. Okay, just gonna go on very quickly. Oops. So really it comes down to, why is the reaction different between these two global massive central banks? Well, the ECB has said thus far that there's a weaker level of inflation. Most recent inflation numbers we have are 5% for the Eurozone, 7% for the US. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the Euro area recovery is not as advanced as the US. And the other important point is the labor force is not as tight. Unemployment rate in the EU is at 6.5% versus 3.9% in the US. The big issue, of course, is that youth unemployment is a bigger issue in Europe as well. It's at 15.4%, most recent numbers was coming from Eurostat, and 8.2% in the US. Structurally, the situation for Europe is very different than it is for the US. And this is due to increased labor mobility, different labor laws in terms of the ability to hire and fire people. So that's one of the reasons why, one of the major reasons why the ECB has been very cautious about saying, look, we're going to tighten or we're not going to tighten. You know, at this point in time, they've said that they will not tighten in 2022. But you have seen a level of dissent within the ECB about this, about how quickly they should move to reconsider this if inflation remains high. And the big issue that the ECB will be looking at and is looking at is the expectations hitting wages. If trade unions will insist on some form of compensation or indexation to adjust wages. Because we haven't had inflation at this level in Europe for many years. We've in fact had a very low inflation environment or negative, deflationary environment prior to that, following on from the 2009 crisis. So this is a whole new challenge for the ECB. You know, at 5%, that's the highest level it had been in 13 years, almost a generation. So people aren't really used to dealing with inflation anymore, getting their heads around it. Governments have been able to rely upon very low, low inflation. Therefore, their costs in terms of the bonds that they issue have been very, very low. And now it's a whole new, potentially a whole new area for them, whole change for them. Now, one of the big things in terms of inflation, as I said, of course, that relationship between energy and inflation, and why energy prices are actually probably going to stay higher in Europe than they are in the US. And part of this is, and I kind of touched upon this earlier, the EU green energy requirements. There's a lot of plans, and the energy plan for Europe, which is known as the EPE, which is looking to promote renewable energy, secure foreign energy supply, and encourage R&D of energy technologies. The problem with this, and this goes back to that point of greenflation, is that we're not there yet within Europe. And as we slowly move towards that those net zero targets, which differ by country across the EU, we have 2050, some countries it's 2035, 2045, 2040. That we're still going to be relying upon the old fossil fuels until we get the new things in place. So that's the point of the green technology hasn't come into play yet. The other big thing is geopolitical tensions in Europe. Obviously, we're seeing this at present between what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and NATO, and the relationships between the importers, which is all of Europe pretty much, with the exception of Spain. Spain only imports a very, very small percentage of its gas, if any, actually. I don't know if it still does, from Russia, so it's not as affected. But it is affected by geopolitical tensions in the Middle East a bit, because it gets a lot of its energy from Morocco and from Algeria, and has to go by Morocco, and there are problems with that gas pipeline. So the geopolitical tensions have added to worries about, in an already tight energy market. OPEC Plus is having trouble meeting its monthly production targets. In fact, they're meeting again next week, as is the ECB. So do stay tuned for that type of news. And the US is also more than 1 million barrels short of its record daily output. So we're having a supply problem potentially coming through as well. And over this time period, we've also had falls in domestic gas production in Europe itself. It's been falling in the Netherlands and the UK, meaning that there's a growing share of gas that Europe consumes that has to come from abroad. And the competition for that gas is getting a lot tighter, particularly coming from rising Asian demand. Okay, we're competing essentially in many ways with China. Now, China obviously has said that they're going to go, and this goes back to this whole point of net zero, where they're going to, but it's the issue of they're looking to reduce their coal fire production over the past, because the problems that they had, again, they've had an energy crunch as well. They actually didn't stop in the autumn. They allowed coal fire production to increase a bit. So that freed up a little bit more of the particularly liquefied natural gas into Europe. But this is, again, the reasons why energy prices will most likely be higher in Europe. Again, the US is a net exporter of energy, so it's not as much of an issue for them. The Middle East, of course, is a net exporter, and it really will come down to how quickly and the types of new energy that can be produced. We've also had problems, again, moving towards relying on wind, relying on other types of renewables, because they're just not there yet in terms of levels of production. And we also are looking at the closure of coal mines, as I said, as well as nuclear facilities, particularly in Germany. So the implications of this, of EU, again, green energy policies, in the midterm, the EU ETS, which is the exchange transfer scheme, you have that rising, the prices of that rising faster than replacement energy sources, which is causing a greater dependence on imported gas, particularly liquefied natural gas, over the next 5 years at least. So that's to get to net zero, as I said, and that's, it's the International Energy Agency saying this. They're only saying gas will fall when they're actually at, using 100% clean solutions come into play, and that's going to take a considerable period of time. The big issue that we've had is, particularly when it comes to the ETS, is that in the ETS, that's the amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted by various economic sectors, whether it be electricity generators, chemical producers, metallurgy, et cetera, across that. So that amount of emission allowance is set by the EU each year, okay? And it's being reduced each year, which has resulted in increasing price for that each year. And in summer 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, but summer 2020, the EU stepped up its emission reduction target for 2030 from 40% to 55%. So that made, they had to have various regulatory adjustments applied to the ETS to make it consistent with these new climate goals, including a faster rate of reduction in annual emission allowances. So the price of emissions in Europe, those ETS, increased almost threefold. Okay, they went up from about 30 euros per ton equivalent of CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, to about a little under 90 now. So that's going to be a very big factor. Right, I'm going to very quickly touch upon the specifics of Spain. Okay, Spain, as we know, is the sixth largest sixth roughly largest energy consumer in Europe. This data might be going back 2019, 2020, so forgive me if it's not quite up to date. As I said, Spain doesn't have a domestic supply, but doesn't really import gas from Russia. The problem is that it gets its gas from Algeria. And there have been problems with that particular pipeline, the Maghreb Europe pipeline. It is also potentially getting energy from Medgas. And it's a geopolitical issue. Algeria, Morocco, there's potential they might even go to war this year. It's probably very low. I'm not an expert on that area. But again, when there are these types of geopolitical risks, it slows down that gas into Spain. So it's going to affect the overall price in Spain. And one of the main problems of Spain is that households are very exposed to these changes because most are on variable rather than fixed tariffs. Now, of course, last autumn, the government did try to take various actions. I believe they had a €3 billion raid on energy company profits. They've tried to supply tax cuts to consumers, which are looking, I believe, to continue, particularly on the VAT side, electricity consumption until 30th of April this year. And beneficiaries of the electricity social voucher will maintain their discounts of between 60 and 70% of their consumption. There's, as I said, that's mainly the main problem for Spain, is that it is highly dependent on this imported energy. And it's now competing with other countries, both within Europe and globally. So even if it wants to get, particularly for the LNG gas, the liquefied natural gas, so even it's having to pay an increased price on that. That transmits through to the input costs, as I said, which translates through to higher prices for everyone, lowering consumer demand. And when you already have a closed economy or economy hit by COVID, it's not looking particularly good. And then, as I said, you add on top of that what is happening in terms of EU policy, energy prices will stay higher for longer. So that's, basically it at the moment, I think. Why don't we go into some questions if you have any, in terms of, I can discuss a little bit about, where we see things moving forward.
Of course, Renee, I have a few questions because it's been interesting, very interesting, this presentation. And there's a question that just come up that is regarding especially this debate about inflation. I mean, inflation here in Spain, for example, it's kind of getting crazy because one thing is the CPI read, for example, another thing is the real inflation. So there's a disconnection in there between the two. And the guess that is kind of floating around is that if there's an intention about getting people poorer so that the enormous debt would fade with the increasing inflation, if hyperinflation could be a nice way to kind of solve government problems regarding the debt, for example, and all that jazz. And on the other side, on the flip side, there's another theory, or a lot of people is talking about that. I'm not just giving my opinion, huh? But the other extreme of the question is that there's this other idea of technology, disruptive innovation that is just it could bring just quite the opposite, deflation. So this debate is I don't understand it, actually. So that's the thing. I'm just being honest. I don't understand it. I don't know what's going to happen. So if you could help me a little.
I would say that, Spain's December, in December, from what I understand, its inflation rate, I think in December was 6.7%. That's not hyperinflation. It's higher inflation, but it's not hyperinflation by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. So I don't think that the government is looking to inflate away its level of debt. And it really, it really counts because, again, it's the euro, and the euro is controlled by the ECB. And the ECB, the only way, that happens if you have a massive depreciation of the euro, and that isn't going to happen. Mm-hmm. Because, again, you think about what is the mandate, one of the mandates of the ECB, it's about price stability as well.
Totally.
And financial sector stability. So there's not going to be a massive, I can pretty much guarantee that there would not be a massive devaluation of the euro. There's not going to be an inflation away of the government debt. So I wouldn't worry about that. When you look at this point of automation, as you mentioned, happening in terms, are you speaking of, it's a question of increasing productivity. And for companies, they can pay higher wages if there's also increasing productivity. So it shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing necessarily. And I don't think it will lead to a deflation. It depends what you're looking at being automated, but generally automation, are you talking about just in terms of consumer prices or?
Well, the theory is like kind of this idea of that technology and this disruptive innovation that is kind of invading the world. It's bringing many products that eventually are kind of bringing deflation because of there are many products, for example, through apps, through many, this kind of disruption is bringing us many things for free. So that idea could lead towards a deflation. That's just a theory. It's not mine. Huh? I'm just asking because I don't understand either of that. I'm the expert, not me.
As technology develops, and we see this in technology. You think of your mobile phone, right? The cost of mobile phones have generally dropped. The cost of the technology has dropped. However, there are some core things that go into it that won't drop. Whether it be the commodities because of increasing levels of demand. So, what's in a mobile phone? It is lithium, which is also used in renewable energy. It's cobalt, also used in renewable energy. And it's also just more as the technology itself. We learn more about that, and it becomes better understood and easier to develop over time and replicate. So that cost will reduce, and if you deflation in that way. But in terms of how that hits the wider economy, no, it won't lead to wider drops in overall inflation, most likely.
Sounds good. So I have another question that has to do with this overall presentation. That given the macro scenario, that this one is mine. Huh? This question is mine. So given the macro scenario you've laid out, can you give us some ideas of sectors that are poised to take advantage of this macro scenario?
I think in terms of the sectors that perform best, again, it's if you're looking within the energy sector itself, over the short term, obviously, there's a lot going on within this, and this goes back to the climate change thing, because they're also being affected within the energy sector by investors saying, look, we're concerned about materiality risks. We're concerned about having stranded assets, and therefore the actual value of the company might be lower. A lot of energy companies are looking to invest in renewables. When I say renewables, it is a lot of looking at what's happening in terms of hydrogen development, what's happening in terms of biomass development, carbon capture and storage technologies. When you're looking at commodities, as I mentioned, what goes into renewables, aluminium. what goes into, as I said, lithium, cobalt, other types of things that go into that, what goes into battery production. So there will be a big growth within those sectors, most likely. And you've already seen reflection in the price of commodities. And the companies that are producing the technologies that are going to be required as part of that green revolution. I say required because this is now EU legislated. So if you're looking at sectors, those, when you have legislation, it's in there, it's regulated, it has to happen, then you're going to be seeing the price of those companies operating in those sectors and operating successfully increasing, the values of those companies increasing. Totally.
And the last question that I have is regarding the present situation. It's kind of geopolitics. So this present situation, the brawl between Russia and Ukraine. So can you walk us through this pickle?
Sure. Well, I think when it comes to the energy scenario, obviously there was accusations, as I said, concerns of why all of a sudden the gas price go up. Remember, as I said, Europe is highly dependent on gas from from Russia. It takes about a third of it. Germany, being the biggest importer of Russian gas, and we are looking at the development of Nord Stream 2, which is another pipeline through. Now, previously, when there's been the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia since 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, took over Crimea, etc., and then we had Russian forces going into eastern Ukraine. Sanctions were imposed on Russia at that time. The Russian economy did suffer at that point, but then it bounced back to a certain extent. And a lot of that, as we've seen, particularly the past couple of years, has been energy prices. They have within their budget $44 per barrel. It's now again close to 90 for oil. So they've been doing very, very well. They have plenty of money in their coffers now, essentially, in their foreign reserves. So there's this game going on between Russia and NATO. This stems back to 2014, why Russia invaded into Ukraine back then. It's an ongoing situation of potential NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, which Russia obviously doesn't want. We've seen, a letter came out from US President Biden to Russia yesterday. NATO has been sending additional reserves and weaponry to Lithuania, to Poland, to Latvia. So this thing standing at the borders, but in many ways, and I've been a Russia watcher off and on for the past 30 years. In many ways, is this a case of, okay, if the West says we're going to impose sanctions, you now have said Europe stepping up and going, wait a minute, and particularly Germany, we're really dependent on Russia for gas. We can't do this because it's going to negatively affect our economies. And if Russia were to, if sanctions happen and those prices, again, of liquefied natural gas, which will then have to come from the Middle East and from the US. And again, you're competing with Asia, a growing Asia, for that resource, and all the European countries will be competing. It's going to affect each individual economy's level of growth, and it could affect it quite substantially. I mean, I've seen numbers of, say, 1.5% of GDP. It could really hit GDP if that were to happen. So at present, you have countries such as Germany saying, look, if we're going to discuss sanctions, let's be careful with this. We're not, let's keep Nord Stream 2 out of this. We don't want to lose our supply. Previously, when there have been disruptions, it was actually only to Ukraine that was disrupted and not the rest of Europe. So that has changed. In many ways, this is again a bit of a very smart geopolitical game by Russian President Putin. In that, you think back, it's been 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Russia lost its satellites. Soviet Union lost its satellites, and NATO, primarily under the guise of the US, expanded quite a bit, and there were promises within, particularly Eastern Europe. And now after 30 years, this in many ways is perhaps Putin's way of saying, look, the rest of Europe isn't going to pay for its defense. It's all dependent upon the US, and is there really the political will in the US to do this? given what they've been through, in the past 30 years, and never mind of the past 5 to 10, in terms of the cost of Afghanistan and other things there, in terms of, and is the American public willing to have American troops be subjected to something again overseas that it feels that they have nothing to do with? So it's a political play by Putin to kind of get the US out of its backyard 30 years on.
Totally.
The other big issues, though, when we look at the energy market in terms of geopolitics, there has been things happening in the Middle East. There was an attack on Dubai, I believe it was, United Arab Emirates, about a week and a half ago on a pipeline. Also, we're looking at what's happening in terms of the new discussions with Iran and whether, and their nuclear deal, and whether or not that will be renewed, what will happen around there as tensions get higher in the Middle East, which will probably happen. We also, as I mentioned, we have the OPEC plus meeting. So it's OPEC plus their allies meeting next week. They've promised to increase production. They've not been able to at this point. Will they? So there's a lot going on geopolitically that will affect the price of energy moving forward, and that overall inflation level and how quickly inflation will be able to come down. Again, a lot of this goes into that changing inflation expectation story. And this is something, again, for generations, because hasn't been that high for over a decade. People aren't used to dealing with this. It's a shock. It's not going to be like it was in the 70s and the energy price shock there, and the inflation shock there, and that hyperinflation that you said, well, they can just get their jet away. They can't. But it is an adjustment.
It's an adjustment, and it's in my case, for example, what I experienced here is that, I remember paying in the bill, the electricity bill was kind of 100 plus euros in my case, and now it's 240 plus. So it's true, it's a big place, but anyways, it's enormous. The increase has been kind of, skyrocketing. And it's something that it's a big topic, I think, now, the inflation is a big topic. I don't know if it'll change, but now it's a big topic.
It'll continue to be a very big topic. Again, a lot of eyes will be on whether or not the ECB does decide to take further action, not just in terms of saying, okay, we're reducing our PEP program. They may look to reduce their further bond program, which their asset purchases program release liquidity into the market, right? Yeah. And by doing that, it keeps the cost of capital low.
Totally.
Okay, and that's why I've had stock markets performing particularly well over the past few years. We've been in a very good cycle for that. If it starts to raise rates, this is why over the past week, we've seen like the tech sector mostly affected within Europe. We've seen financials, we've seen non-cyclicals, other things affected quite a bit. So it is this point of how sticky is this inflation? And I do think it's going to be a lot stickier in Europe because you have these energy issues in terms of supply. Right. You also have the structural issues. Again, when we look at those employment numbers, they've improved remarkably for Europe compared to what they were, but it's still much, much higher than someplace like the US. Structurally, there's still a number of issues within that in terms of youth unemployment, which was a lot higher. Labor participation rates, it is increasing. I think it's around 74% in Europe, so that's actually higher than within the US. But there is such a divergence in the structural issues within Europe, but it's all under one monetary policy at the moment under the ECB. And this is why you're having the discussions within the ECB itself, and you've seen some big dissenters. The former German representative or president of the German Bundesbank, Jens Weidemann, was like, we really, and of course the Germans are always very, very concerned about inflation for historical reasons, saying the ECB has to take action. And you've had other countries saying, no, we don't want them to take action. So it's going to be on the cards for quite a period of time. I don't think, and indicators seem to show, that it's going to go away anytime soon. The ECB has admitted it's going to, their initial projections were wrong. They raised, their forecast for inflation through this year. It's not expected to go down. I think it's down to 1.8%, maybe 1.9%, the end of into next year, into 2023. So, and that's across the board. It's going to take longer. You're saying in Spain, it's just going to stick around a lot longer, and that's due again to energy. And it may come down in time. We may see some of these bottlenecks fade over time. We may see increased supply again if the situation between Ukraine and Russia comes to some resolution. There was a meeting this past week where they have agreed to discuss it further in terms of the situation in the Donbass, so the pullback of Russian troops that were on the border. So they'll have another discussion, another couple of weeks around that. The situation in the Middle East may calm down a little bit. It's hard to say at this point in time, but it still doesn't. We still have the longer term fact of how the prices will need to go up a little bit at least, or they might drop, but they won't drop to where they were most likely, because we also have this net zero targets. And until we have the replacement energies and things in place, which are going to take years, quite a lot of them, unfortunately, I think a lot of this has been really great ideas, really great commitment to something, but the products and the technology isn't quite there yet.
Totally. I think actually we should bring you more often. It's very nice, I mean, you can explain. I mean, it's very nice to see the view of an expert that it's out of Spain, talking about Spain, and it's it's very nice. Actually, it's very interesting to listen to you, and I think I've learned a lot, and I hope our audience is going to learn a lot. I'm sure about it. I
hope so too. I think for Spain, it'll be a lot of, as I said, when things recover from COVID, when the rates go down, as vaccination rates go up, as people travel more, as we see the restrictions drop, the economy will recover somewhat. But I think the important thing, as I said, for all economies, and that across Europe and perhaps globally, people are really looking at, and that goes back to what caused all this in terms of that surge in many ways, not just in energy, but in demand and how that was dealt with, of strategic companies, perhaps saying, okay, we don't want more onshoring, perhaps, and that might come into play. I can't say it will in Spain. I can't say it will in every country. Each country has its own particular industrial policy. But that is one of the things that may happen down the line. I think it will get, it has definitely caused a change in the policy debates that you see happening at governmental levels.
Totally. So thanks a lot, Renée. It's been a pleasure to have you on. And I hope you grant us having you again.
Love to.
With you, because it's lovely. So thanks a lot, Renée. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.